School shooter drills, more training for first responders, and support for gun safety legislation. And in Ohio, the Cincinnati Enquirer is reporting on a new robotic dog at the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport. Its name is Rover, which stands for Remote Observer Virtual Responder. The new technology is meant to help automate jobs, increase security, and help customers have a more seamless flight. All right, still ahead, Ukraine is expecting dozens of tank deliveries from Western allies, including at least 14 from the UK. The British ambassador to the United States will join us to talk about the new military aid. Plus, a key economic report is due out next hour, and it could provide clues about the state of the U.S. economy and its outlook in the future. We'll break down the new data with Stephanie Ruhle and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Morning Joe will be right back.
The school ignored multiple warnings the day of the shooting that the 6-year-old had a gun.
What did administrators do? Did administrators call the police? No. Did administrators lock down the school? No. Did the administrators evacuate the building? No. Did they confront the students? No.
Zwerner's attorney laying out a timeline of the day. Just after 11 a.m., Zwerner herself told an administrator the first grader threatened to beat up another student.
They didn't remove the student from the classroom. The school administration failed to act.
At 12:30, according to the attorney, another teacher reported she searched the boy's book bag looking for a gun and believed he may have put it in his pocket and taken it outside to recess.
The administrator downplayed the report from the teacher and the possibility of a gun, saying, and I quote, "Well, he has little pockets."
Shortly after 1, Zwerner's attorney says a teacher reported that a student said the 6-year-old showed him the gun and threatened to use it. Finally, a 4th employee asked to search the boy, but was told to wait for the day to end. Zwerner was shot roughly an hour later, seriously wounded in her hand and chest, but still managed to escort about 20 students out of her class to safety. Earlier this month, the school superintendent did acknowledge at least one administrator was notified of a possible weapon.
Stephanie Gosk reporting for us there. Claire, we've been talking about this morning. Something just doesn't add up here. I mean, first of all, think about this poor teacher. Thank God she survived being shot in her own classroom. The poor first graders who watched their teacher get shot. That's with them forever. Can it really be true, especially in this day and age when our antennae are so up about school shootings, that there were multiple warnings that a kid had a gun in school? It was in his backpack. Now I think it's in his pocket. He flashed it to another kid and threatened him on the playground. The kid reported to the teachers that no one did anything about this.
Well, there's so many questions here, and obviously the administration of the school district is reeling from the reality of what happened. I think what was foremost, if I had to guess or die, what was foremost in their mind was there's no way a 6-year-old has a gun.
Yeah.
And that's the reality that we have in this country right now. That is probably the scariest of all of the things we're learning about this. Everything's bad about it. What they didn't do, the fact that there wasn't a more aggressive approach. But that's what really this is that everybody was in denial that we could really get to the point that 6-year-olds in the first grade are carrying weapons to school.
And that's the part that a great deal of society in general has failed to recognize, is that we get caught off guard again and again and again. I'm just going to use 9/11 for an example. Who would have thought that somebody would have taken airplanes and turned them basically into live missiles towards killing almost 3,000 people that day? The world is going to have to wake up in understanding that the days that we're living in right now, any and everything is possible. I never would have thought that a 6-year-old kid would have had the capability of going into a school with a gun, number one, and number two, actually pulling it out and shooting it. But you know what? That's the times that we're living in right now. We're living in very, very cautious times to where, and I realize that it probably is a big disturbance towards stopping everything stopping all the classes and everything. But sometimes honest policy is the best policy to make sure that you know that nothing like that does exist. So it was the administration's fault that they didn't take quick, swift action pertaining to this particular youngin.
To aid in its fight against Russia. Meanwhile, Russia is unleashing a new round of attacks on Ukraine today, including missile strikes on the capital city of Kyiv. NBC News foreign correspondent Raf Sanchez has the latest from Ukraine.
This morning, Vladimir Putin's sending a message with a wave of strikes across Ukraine. Dozens of Russian missiles and self-destructing drones targeting Kyiv and other cities. At least one person killed in the capital, according to the mayor. The attack just hours after President Biden reversed course and announced he'll give 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine.
It will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives. The Abrams tanks are the most capable tanks in the world.
The Kremlin responding, these tanks will burn down just like all the other ones. Weighing in at 70 tons and armed with a 120mm cannon, the Abrams has long been the iron fist of the U.S. military. But it's difficult to maintain and could be months before it reaches the battlefield. Ukraine instead hoping Germany's Leopard 2 tanks will arrive in time to head off a fresh Russian offensive, possibly in the coming weeks, according to Ukrainian officials. President Zelensky saying a sense of relief comes only after the weapons which our partners give us are already being used by our army. Zelensky overnight also meeting with the UN's top official for refugees. We caught up with him as he surveyed the damage from previous Russian bombing in Kharkiv.
Every time is as painful and as frustrating and as horrible as the first time.
Nearly a year into the war, 8 million Ukrainians are refugees outside their country, and millions more are displaced inside it. Among them, 32-year-old Irina Prokofieva, who depends on aid to care for her baby son, Makar. The 9-month-old born weeks into the war in a hospital also treating wounded Russian troops. It's impossible to buy anything here, she says. People left with almost nothing, sharing what little they have.
NBC's Raf Sanchez with that report, and joining us now, the British ambassador to the United States, Karen Pierce. Thank you so much.
In other words, it's turned into nothing but a big humanitarian crisis.
This shift in military support from Western allies bringing tanks to Ukraine. Can you share with us what is at stake in making a decision like this and what had to be considered?
Well, thank you, Mika, and good morning. It's an important decision. It's obviously a very serious one, as you say, and we heard the president yesterday saying this was important for strategic objectives. It's standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. We absolutely endorse that, and I'm sure that Germany and other allies do as well. The reason we're sending tanks is because the war in Ukraine has reached a certain stage where Ukraine needs more military capability in order to push the Russians back and defend the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian territory. And I think we saw those awful pictures. You can see how indiscriminately President Putin's forces are attacking civilians and attacking infrastructure. Excuse me. And so we all came to the conclusion, and Ukraine asked, that sending tanks was a proportionate and a calibrated response to that indiscriminate aggression from the Russians.
But that indiscriminate aggression is happening now, like right at this moment as we speak. And I know the tanks will take months. So what about during this gap?
Well, we're continuing to supply Ukraine with ammunition, with Western ammunition. We're continuing to train Ukrainian forces. Some of the tanks will get there relatively quickly. We continue to help Ukraine with economic and humanitarian support. Fundamentally, this is all about building up Ukrainian capability. But I would just like to pause on what you said, Mika. These attacks from the Russians, they could be war crimes. they may, attacks on civilians and infrastructure indiscriminately can amount to war crimes. So we want to pursue the issue of accountability as well. And every Russian commander who takes part in them will at some point be held accountable. I do want to stress that.
Ambassador, we are obviously in awe of what the European community has done to welcome Ukrainians who have fled from this war zone. But I wanted to ask you, we're beginning to see some cracks in the support for Ukraine among one of our political parties, namely the Republican Party. Are you seeing the same kind of political reality in the UK with some people beginning to want us to pull back from this very, very important commitment?
Support for Ukraine in the UK is absolutely solid, Mika. It's very much a bipartisan issue. British people have welcomed the Ukrainian refugees into their homes. There's a lot of support for sending the Challenger tanks, a lot of support for the government continuing to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. And I think here in America, to be honest, what I see is that the vast majority of members of both parties, including on the Hill, want to continue to support Ukraine, want to help Ukraine defend herself, defend her people, and start pushing the Russians out.
Madam Ambassador, good morning. Jonathan Lemire. We heard a lot from the president and other leaders about the importance of keeping Europe united, this alliance united. But there was some tension over these tanks. In fact, if Germany had not acted to move, Poland had suggested they were going to act on their own and send some. And that could have been a real flashpoint there were that to have happened. We have been talking all morning about how these tanks are a long-haul commitment, and this war may have years ahead of it. What is your level of concern about keeping Europe together so united as the economic toll of this conflict increases and other potential flashpoints emerge?
I think one of the remarkable things about the Ukraine conflict is how united the NATO alliance and Europe have actually been in the face of some provocation and taunts and flesh creeping from President Putin. You know, it's no surprise that each ally has its own decision-making procedures. It's also no surprise in democracies that some of that is conducted in full view of the press and the public, and that's absolutely as it should be. But you see in the tank decision and in all the other decisions that we've taken recently, the alliance is absolutely solid behind Ukraine, and we're not going to give up. We are, as President Biden said yesterday, going to carry on standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
British Ambassador to the United States, Karen Pierce, thank you very much. And on tomorrow's show, Joe will be reporting live from the Auschwitz concentration camp in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Amid the new war in Europe and the Russian atrocities being perpetrated against innocent civilians of Ukraine right now, the rise of authoritarianism across the globe and the increase in anti-Semitism around the world, there has never been a more important time to never forget. And as part of the coverage, you'll have an exclusive interview from Poland with second gentleman Douglas Emhoff, who is also retracing his family roots there. Full report live from Auschwitz tomorrow with Joe. Willie?
We'll look forward to that, Miko. Meanwhile, this morning, following the revelations that both President Joe Biden and former Vice President Mike Pence were...
You know, it's reached a point in the war that that our United States military has to basically choose between the lesser of the two evils, that which would be worse towards allowing for Russia to go ahead and destroy Ukraine and all its capability towards resisting what they're wanting to do to the Ukrainians, and then later on these same advancements would probably happen with other European countries over there, or back it up now and try to stop it, prevent it from escalating even further. So it's reached a very sensitive point in the American military strategy point of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And whenever it does that, then you got to choose between, well, which is going to be the lesser of the two evils pertaining to what's going to be the consequences on A versus B. And I personally believe that they have made the right decision, though I'm a complete total against all wars, any wars, pertaining to peace and the teachings out of the Bible. But whenever you have a monstrosity such as Russia that is basically treating the Ukrainian people like it's his own personal whipping post towards a country that's got 11 time zones compared to ours. It's only got 4 or 5. I mean, you got a scenario of David Goliath, and for the rest of the countries to sit idly by and not do something would basically be saying that these countries that choose not to do nothing is an accessory to the crime. And it is a crime. First of all, it was not a practical, justifiable reason for him doing what he done. They was not threatened. The Russian government was not threatened in the regard towards bullets and missiles and etc. coming over the border. So this deliberate attack is totally unjust and immoral in every way imaginable. And to think that the Russian government thought that it could do this and get away with it, it just shows to me how naive that these people over there in Russia pertaining to President Putin really is. It's reached a pivotal point with our American politicians that you're either going to be on board, full steam ahead, or you're going to try to manipulate the people in making one of the worst choices that I believe that they could possibly make by not pursuing this. You've got a couple politicians that's already anti-war and spewing out anti-war sentiments in every way possible. And I'm anti-war too. Don't get me wrong. I am totally anti-war. But whenever it comes time for you to defend the innocent, it wouldn't be no different if there was somebody in front of your yard, in front of your house that you could visually see that was attacking a innocent child or an innocent elderly person, and you just sat idly by and did not do absolutely nothing. That's one of the I guess you'd call it complaints that I have about this particular region in Northwest Tennessee where I was raised up at, in a group of people whenever I was just a young child, 45, 50, even go back 55 years ago, whenever we first come back into this area in 1967, that so many people could have cared less about my father's family, pertaining to my father suffering, obviously, through post-traumatic stress disorder of the scars that he went through during World War II, and nobody was willing to confront him personally or make a telephone call in getting somebody out here that could confront him. In other words, it was strictly taboo for you to intervene in somebody raising their family out here. And I could put my finger on probably a half a dozen plus families around in this area that basically raised their children the same way, raised them up by the hair of the head, raised them up abusing them, physically, emotionally, abusing them, calling them all kinds of bad names. You worthless piece of you know what. I mean, I could go on and on and on towards the abuse that people was doing during that time period. And I guess those people, they themselves was abused, and it was like a disease, like a cancer. It just spread, and nobody was willing to stand up against it. And there's no doubt children that are mean, that are disobedient, they need their tails tore up pertaining to whatever that they are causing. That way the parent can stay in check of the child. But whenever it becomes unreasonable for what the parent is doing to the child, that's whenever it's time for the community to stand up. That was one of the biggest things that broke David's heart, my brother David Jeffrey Jackson, was whenever we stood up against the abusivenesses with 3 little children across the road. And we involved ourselves, because of the children, in calling up child abuse services in Nashville and child abuse services here in Weakley County. And instead of that getting checked into properly like it should have had, my brother died because wasn't nothing happening out here pertaining to taking care of the children, as well as all the other problems that had formigated out here in our lives. And of course, after he died, I was under this cloud of grief and despair that they took advantage of me during an emotional time of my life and arrested me and turned the tables around like I and my brother was stalking these people across the road, but knowing that there was a background, a pattern of either them or the landlord steadily stirring up trouble over here at 291 Thompson Road or 430 Beach Grove Road. And for the judicial system to have done what they done speaks volumes. Proof is in the pudding. Speaks volumes how that they support illegalness more so than goodness. They support illegalness more so than goodness. I mean, whenever you pop a sign out on your building that it's a recovery shelter based around the 3 H's, habits, hang-ups, and heartaches, and then you pop up another big sign pertaining to how you feel in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, pertaining to the teachings of the Bible, and you get basically shoved down the pits of hell because of you trying to do a good deed in that particular community, and the judicial system in that area basically supports them more so than they support you, that, my friend, is speaking volumes. Proof is in the pudding towards what the Weakley County judicial system, beginning with Mike Wilson, that is now retired, and the various judges that's in power right now, which is Tommy Moore and Mike Pence, and etc. It speaks volumes about that group of people, as well as the Martin PD and others who have allowed for this ungodliness to just rage. And then when somebody such as myself comes back into the area and tries to help the innocent, they get punished. They get punished for it. And I've said this before, whenever this country starts operating the same type of scenario as you would in a prison system, because I've been in jail, I've been in prisons, and I've seen how they react. You're in a pod with 40 or 50 men or 40 and 50 women, and all of a sudden there's a disturbance inside that pod. Well, you're not supposed to be a tattletale and tell any of the CO officers towards what occurred, because if you do, then you're going to take a chance on the very same violence now coming down the pike your way. I've even actually seen people get the you-know-what beat out of them, and the CEO come in there and ask questions. Well, what happened? What happened? Oh, I fell. I had a problem in the shower and I fell. Oh, okay. You're all bruised up in your rib cage. Your arm is almost broken. You got a bloody lip. You got a black eye. Your ear is hanging off the side of your head. And you're telling me that all this happened just because of a fall? Yes, sir, officer. So unless you get somebody that's willing to stand up to evil, guess what happens with evil? Evil aggressively even gets that much more powerfuler. And I've said this and I'll say it again. Your judicial system that handle the courts pertaining to your attorneys, your judges, your probation officers, etc., are only as good as the people that put them in power. Because if you got a bunch of clonies like Mike Wilson had, with a bunch of these people that have the power to fight them, and they're basically pulling the punches, that means that the judicial system up in Dresden, Tennessee, or Obion, Tennessee, or any parts of Tennessee, or any parts of this nation, abides by those pretenses. And that is not what and how that our judicial system was set up. Our judicial system was set up on guilt and innocence, not on favoritisms. And that's what's happening here in the United States. And that's the reason why Donald J. Trump, that was the United States president at one time, though I don't agree with what and how that he went about doing January the 6th, whenever he spoke up about the system being rigged, this is in the format that it's rigged in. Whenever you have so many dishonest people that it outweighs the honest people, whenever you have so many cruel, indifferent, mean-spirited people versus good people, then things becomes out of whack. As things become out of whack, that's whenever God basically lifts his hand off of that particular community or that nation or off that state, and he allows for basically those people to be ravaged again and again and again by the supernatural forces that are now coming out of the sky pertaining to it either being incredibly too hot or incredibly too cold. In other words, the judicial system has a great deal to do with the forces of nature system, and whenever the forces of nature system starts having to intervene pertaining to bringing hardship up onto that society, it's doing that to try to change that society. And if the society refuses to change, guess what happens to the forces of nature? They even get worse and worse and worse and worse till eventually you will be thrown off into great tribulation. And whenever I say great tribulation, I'm not just talking about tribulation in general. I'm talking about great tribulation. And my friends, if you think that things is unproportionately out of whack now, you ain't seen out of whack whenever God comes back in flaming fire, taking vengeance upon them that know not him and upon them who obey not the gospel. You ain't seen things out of whack until he comes back and burns down every structure upon to the planet down to the ground, and basically the people will be left in a very, very merciful state because your leadership, your good, did not stand up against the bad. And that is in the direction that we're heading in right now, in a very, very dramatic, heartbreaking type way. And people like me can see this, and people like me speak up about this, just like the anti-Semitism pertaining to the Holocaust survivors. Even my brother has spoken up about what type of childhood that we had here in this area and said, Juby, we're the next thing to being Holocaust survivors. In other words, we went through something and we survived it only by the hand and the mercy of God. Because if we was dependent upon various people throughout the community or the law in this area to protect us pertaining to these atrocities that was happening in our lives, we never would have gotten it. Which once more speaks volumes about certain people that was in that I was raised up in that era, and it also speaks volumes about the judicial system that's in power right now in Weakley County that would be willing to allow for a family to go through that. It's sickening. And it would be just as sickening if the United States sat idly by and did not help the weak and the innocent pertaining to the Ukrainians.
President Donald Trump to Facebook and Instagram a little more than 2 years.
I don't want to hear nothing about that. That, to me, that's just more propaganda. More BS. It's more of a distraction towards pulling us away from the things that we should be talking about and discussing and looking at, versus now pulling towards wanting to discuss about him.
The January 6th.
And that's another big no-no that our American citizenship has fallen into, towards being lured into these. I ain't going to say that they're trivial, because they're not trivial, but being lured into areas to where we should be focused upon other bigger areas, that we continue to keep distracting towards doing our jobs. Now, this individual right here, he brings up a good point that I haven't really thought about pertaining to Mr. Pence, which was the vice president during Donald Trump's administration, pertaining to how that he sat idly by for probably about 2 weeks, seeing all this stuff fester and build up, knowing the controversy that was going on pertaining to the election, because you had an election denier that was steadily spewing out the rhetoric of what he was spewing out pertaining to the election being stolen. And it was the vice president that did not stand up to his own president, because at that point in time the election was already over, and saying, Mr. President, you're wrong. You're wrong by you continually stirring the pot and spewing out this type of rhetoric. And he never did. Mr. Pence never did. A matter of fact, it was only up until the very last moment, the very last day, whenever the transition of power was going to take place, to where I think Donald Trump actually still thought that his buddy, his right-hand man, was going to stand with him. Because up until that time, Pence did not utter a word against his pre-existing boss man, which would have been Donald J. Trump at the time. Never stood up against him. Never stood up against the propaganda. Knowing that the proof was in the pudding pertaining to the facts in the data being contrary to the things that Donald J. Trump was spewing out to the American people. So yes, in more ways than one, Mr. Pence should be held just as accountable for what went on as Donald J. Trump. Because he sat back and let it fester and fester and fester until the January 6th deal actually come to a head.
Select committee, that Facebook in particular was a gathering place for people before the 6th and to foment all the ideas that led to that day.
Yeah, and it's absolutely a mystifying decision on their part. I mean, I just think they think that, oh, well, the fire's out, so let's, even though this guy has a cache of matches and gasoline that he carries around with him, let's just let him play with matches again. And it's just, it's ridiculous, because if you look at what he says daily, day in, day out, on his Truth Social website, he's in a lot of ways worse than he was a couple of years ago. He's lost touch with reality in a way that, I mean, he always had little touch with reality, but he's worse today. You know, all the racist attacks on Elaine Chao, and he's just, it's not going to work out very well.
Coming up, another election denier who has been suspended from Twitter in the past, Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now she reportedly is angling to be Donald Trump's running mate in 2024. New details next on Morning Joe.
And as long as the American people allow to be toiled with and played with this way, by letting people like this fester and
Conway, you know what?
And become basically a stumbling block to the American people. As long as the people in general allow for this to go on, it's going to continue to go on. It's going to continue to fester and fester because it is now become a disease. It has now become an obsession. And it's not so much what it is, but how it is. It's the way that they're doing it right in front of our very eyes, hidden in plain view, per se, kind of like that child with that gun. Well, we just can't believe that little Johnny's going to come in here with a gun. That's an unbelievable story. Well, we didn't believe that somebody was going to take airplanes and turn them into live missiles, but we seen it occur. And how many times have we been caught blindsided of various things that's happened within our lifetime here in America? That ain't even talking about all the other stuff that goes on in all the other countries. But just right here in America, how many times have we been caught unaware? Caught unaware. To the point that we shake our heads and don't do nothing other than say, well, I never would have thought that would have happened. Well, I never would have thought that person would have stooped that low. Well, I never would have thought she would have said that. Well, I never would have thought that he would have said that or done that. That's looking at the aftermath of what has occurred. To be a good leader in good leadership, you have to stop the fire before it ever gets started. And that's the areas that our American politicians has failed us in towards protecting us and allowing for us to be $32 trillion in debt. And now they're still debating upon the debt ceiling of raising it again and again and again and 1,000 times again, and seeing the gun problem and the drug problem and all the other problems over here in America that is related around what the ministry of the church society has not done, that once more has sat back and tolerated this, allowed it to fester. Allowed it to fester. I truly believe that whenever the Supreme Court done what they done during, I think it was Obama's administration, if everybody would have loaded up in their automobiles and wound up in front of the Supreme Court in their decision pertaining to gay marriages, giving them the same rights as regular people, with good sound minds that try to live good, sound, decent lives pertaining to the Christian people according to the Bible, the King James Bible, if people would have loaded up and done something about that right then, they could have actually turned that around. But what did we do? We sat idly by with our hands underneath our hips and shook our heads and said, well, I can't believe that. I can't believe that. Well, you need to start believing that. Because that's the very thing that you sat back and allowed to happen. And now it's affecting your children and your grandchildren. And that's affecting your life. And that's affecting the hemisphere pertaining to the natural forces coming out of the heavens. Because of what we have tolerated down here on the planet. We brought this upon to ourselves. By being very naive. God didn't intend for his people to be run over like this.
Congress is already reportedly angling to be his running mate. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is said to have her sights set on becoming Trump's pick for vice president. That's according to an exclusive report from NBC News. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon told NBC News Greene sees herself on the short list for Trump's VP. A second source who has advised Greene said her, quote, whole vision is to be vice president. The source added that Greene's VP ambitions are at the heart of an effort to rebrand herself as a politician who can work with Republican hardliners and its establishment wing. This could explain why she was so heavily involved in the push to get Kevin McCarthy elected as Speaker of the House. Bannon said her support of McCarthy was a power move with the long-term goal of being a player. Greene's spokesperson responded to the report saying the Congresswoman is laser focused on serving the people of Northwest Georgia, adding that her committee work is a top priority and not 2024 rumors. George Conway, you know what? Anything is possible in the age of Trump and in the age to kind of reference back to our previous conversation where these social media companies have absolutely no accountability compared to other publishers. And Nick Clegg can decide whether or not our democracy is safe from criminals who want to rise to power and then abuse our Constitution and our democracy and promote insurrections and riots. I mean, that's kind of where we are. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, I will just put my marker down right here and say this is a potential reality unless people get their heads on straight.
Yeah, oh yeah, I mean, it's, in a way, she's perfect. Trump, Green, 24, a crack in every pot. This will be the sociopath party ticket.
And I tend to wonder if the world, the world that we live in today here in America is pertaining to the crackpots. You know, whenever you get enough crackpots that's voting in crackpots, well, guess who's going to be in power? The crackpots. And that's what we're seeing manifesting itself right in front of our very eyes. That I've said this all along. It's kind of like the sequence Survivor. Whenever at the end of the week, after they get through going through all of what they was going through, they all come together towards voting one particular person off the island. And that was the whole sequence in that deal of the Survivor towards the last man standing. Well, how can you vote the people off the island whenever the people that you're trying to get off the island owns part of the island or actually owns the island? That's the scenario that we're being backed up into. And if we can't recognize that as true born-again Christians in identifying their connivingness towards what that they're trying to do by coming in and re-rectifying our whole concept of who the American people are and what the American people are. If we can't recognize that whenever people such as myself are telling you the whole time that this is happening, then you have no one at that point in time to blame other than yourselves. And whenever all hell comes busting loose from the skies, regardless whether it comes from the east or the west, you have no one to blame but yourself. Whenever everything falls apart right in front of your very face, after people such as myself was giving out these warnings, giving out these messages, continuously giving out these messages again and again and again that you was obviously ignoring, once this comes to a head, then people such as myself will sit idly by and watch everything basically fall apart right in front of them. And yes, it will be a very, very sorrowful, grieveful time that people such as myself are going to have to witness. But at the same time, it will be a time for us to say, nanny, nanny, boo-boo. We told you it was occurring. We told you what was happening right in front of your very eyes, and you would not listen. You would not correspond with the warnings. And if you'll go back and look at the same characteristics, every time God appointed various prophets of God, regardless whether it was Abraham or Noah or Jacob or whoever, that come forth with a mighty, mighty message, if the people didn't take heed to the messenger pertaining to the message, guess what happened to that culture? Guess what happened to that society of people? Horror. Not usually comes, but will come in return. Because you did not aggressively stand up against that in which what was happening right in front of your very eyes. In other words, it was hidden. It was hidden in plain view. Hidden in plain view. And that's exactly what Donald Trump done. He done what he done in plain view. And he probably is so gung-ho that he probably thinks that he can do it again. And who's to say that he can't? Because if the American people, especially the Christian people, was that gullible that they sat back and allowed for that to fester the way that it did, along with all the other politicians, including Mike Wilson, who's to say that he couldn't do it again? And that's what this woman, and that's, you know, they're leaning very, very hard towards another Donald Trump reenactment.
She absolutely would play to his worst instincts and play to the worst elements of the Republican base. I think that it's going to turn off the the center of the electorate. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to be serious that she would that she would get this, because Trump cannot take someone as a vice president who's going to potentially upstage him. That's why Mike Pence was so perfect for him. Pence was, so much of a cipher. I mean, he'd drink water when President Trump drank water at a meeting. He would basically nod and do whatever Trump, agree with whatever Trump said, up until that one day on January 6th, which could have been prevented if we had a vice president with a spine who had conceded the election as it should have been conceded long before then.
Long before then. Long before January 6th, the vice president of the people should have looked at that situation and realized this is turning into a debacle, or a debacle, whatever the word may be, debacle. This is turning into something that it shouldn't. And if Vice Pence at that time was a good leader in identifying righteous judgment in what was happening right in front of his very eyes was wrong, that's whenever he should have stood up and said, this is wrong. Now, there was a few people since the hearings that we have heard that did stand up against what was happening, including one of Donald Trump's main critics, which was his daughter. And there was other people that was working around Donald Trump at the time that realized what was happening. But they allowed for it to happen coming right to the very end of the line. And by the time it got to the end of the line, it done already gained so much momentum, then it basically turned into a free-for-all. It turned into a chaotic scene. Once more, people are not taking responsibility for the leadership roles that the people appointed them in to have allowed for this to have gotten in the shape that it's in, or that it gotten in pertaining to the January 6th deal. And that's what this commentator is talking about.
I don't think it's a realistic possibility, but the fact that we're even talking about it is horrific.
John, who knows if this will happen?
Bizarre.
As Mika and George both say, would you put it past Donald Trump? He certainly has. No. He likes her a lot. He likes what she says about him anyway. But let's look at this from the other side. If you're the Biden campaign, assuming he does step out and run, you say, we like this ticket. This would be great. If the idea is to broaden the electorate and win back some of these suburban women, say, that you lost in 2022 and 2020, I'm not so sure this is the way to do it.
When Marjorie Taylor Greene was appointed to some of the top committees in the House, West Wing aides were literally high-fiving each other because they know that she can be painted as the sort of symbol of this new Republican Congress, radical, out there, a 9/11 truther on the Homeland Security Committee. That would just be quadrupled if she were put on Donald Trump's ticket as his vice president. It's already mission accomplished for her. The more she is talked about, the more of a celebrity she becomes on the political right, the more fundraising she can do. She's already a force in the Republican Party. The Biden White House doesn't have to do that. She's already there as someone who is going to have some weight. It would certainly seem unlikely that she would be a VP pick, even though Georgia, of course, looms large on the Electoral College map in 2024. I'm just amused by how Marjorie Taylor Greene's aides and allies are putting out this idea that she can be the bridge between the radical right and the more mainstream Republicans. Yes. I'm curious as to how she, who believes in Jewish space lasers, can be any part of the mainstream Republican Party.
Coming up,
Jewish space lasers. She's a complete, total climate denier, along with Donald Trump, and she is an election denier by spewing out propaganda by telling everybody that the election got stolen. This is a sickness. It's a sickness that is now spreading like a cancer. And it actually speaks volumes about the type of people that are either engaged in this or that is not pointing this out to people about what type of sickness that it is. And I've said all along that we're under siege. We're under it's an invasion. It's coming down from the pits of hell, pertaining to the wicked, evil, demonic people that are trying to do this in a very, very crafty way. They're disguised in doing what they're doing, just as the Bible talks about in wolves in sheep's clothing. They're imposters. And if we don't watch, if we don't watch, they will succeed in doing what they're doing right in front of our very eyes. And this is what the Bible preaches and teaches and warns people about again and again and again, towards be aware, be aware, be aware, be aware. It talks about the thief, that if the person that was aware in knowing when the thief was going to come, they would have been on target in identifying and standing guard. Be aware. Just like the virgins. Those that didn't have the oil, that wasn't prepared, wound up getting in a bad, bad situation once they realized what was happening. And then they had the mendacity of going to the virgins that did have the oil. And it wasn't until they spoke up and said, no, we're not going to loan you none of our oil, because if we do, then we're going to be in the same situation that you're in, towards doing without. And that's where the American people, the American Christian people, have to stand up and say, enough is enough. We're not going to tolerate this anymore, because if we don't watch, this is going to have a direct effect upon our lives in either our generation or the generations to come. That, you know what, I don't want to have to stand in the great white throne judgment, that my accusers below me, the children, my grandchildren, my children's children, are going to stand up and say, well, Pops, you sat back and allowed it to happen. Pops, you'd seen it coming, and you didn't warn the people. You seen the enemy. You were supposed to have been the watchman on the wall, Pops. How come you allowed for this to occur? I just give one example in what I'm talking about. In 2013, the fall of 2013, leading into the winter, I spent about a month, maybe a little bit over, down in Homestead, Florida, working for a body shop down there. And it gave me a little bit of time towards looking at some more of the Floridian history in that particular area pertaining to Miami and etc. And while I was down there, I met up with this guy. Actually, I gave him a ride for like a couple 100 miles down into the Key West whenever they was having a big festivity down there. And he was coming out, I think, in Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania or somewhere up in that area. He had locks in his hair, even though he was white. And he was going to make Key West his home. Well, whenever I got down there, I had the guy's telephone number and stayed in contact with him for like 3 or 4 days before I went back to Homestead. I contacted that guy, and I sat down and I talked to that guy. I said, you know what? I said, you told me that you had a wife and kids and you got a family up in Pennsylvania. You pay child support, and you're kind of starting a new leaf here, and you're starting your life all over again. I said, I'm going to tell you, if you come down here with as many gays and as many lesbians as down here, you're going to become contaminated, and the next thing you know, you're going to become just like they are. Oh, no, that ain't never going to happen to me. No, you're silly. Well, guess what? I called back about 6 months and questioned him. And the very thing that I told him that could occur, occurred. Once more, you can take a good apple and put it in the mix of a bunch of bad apples, and it's not going to cause the bad apples to turn good. If anything, what it's going to do is bring out the bad in that bad apple to the point that that bad apple becomes that much more badder, that much more quicker, because now it's absorbed by nothing but bad apples around that one good apple. Going back to the reflection of the laws of gravity, that one bad apple can spoil the whole bushel basket if you don't preserve it, pick it, prune it, look at it, identify it, and resist up against it. That one bad apple can literally spoil the whole basket of good apples. But I guarantee you can take one good apple and drop it in the middle of all the bad apples. And once more, the laws of gravity are going to do what? They're going to cause that good apple to even become a bad apple even that much more quicker. I'd rather die, just as Ronald Reagan talked about. I'd rather die a physical death than to jeopardize or compromise the stance that I have taken for the Lord Jesus Christ pertaining to the righteousness of God's divine, holy commandments. I'd rather die a physical death than to take a chance on becoming just as contaminated or just as bad as what they are. And the very thing that I told that guy, I think at the time he was like 34, 35 years old. Like I said, I picked him up and gave him a long little ride. We chit-chatted, got to know one another. You know, paid for a meal or two for him, helped him out a little bit. But I told him, I said, man, if you stay down here, you are going to become one of them. And he said, no, I will not. 6 months later, he become one of them. A matter of fact, a little later on, I tried to call back, and there was no answer. There was absolutely no answer. In other words, he done already figured out that I had figured out towards what that he had done. He fell into that entrapment, and now he was one of them. Sad. It's a very, very sad but true story in what I'm telling you about. Birds of a feather flock together. And just as Christ talked about that salt, if it has lost its potency, that what good is it other than to be trampled down by the foot of man? That's exactly what it is. In other words, if you're not stern with your Christianity stance that you're taking for Christ and for the Bible, if you just allow any and everything to come into your life, the next thing you know, you're not going to be no better off than they are. And you're going to become one of them. And that's not what God intended for his children to do. He wanted us to be separated from the wicked, from the demonic, from the plagued, from the damned, from those that obviously did not have no intentions towards being righteous to begin with. They was manipulators, and they was imposters, and they come onto the scene, and now the next thing you know, not only have they become deceived, but now they are part of the bunch that's doing the deceiving. That's lukewarmness. That's the part in the Bible where God talks about that he will spew thee out of thy mouth, that in the last days he will sever the wicked from among the just. That's what's happening right now, my friends. There's a reason why Dennis James Jackson is still alive at the age soon to be 62, even though I've went through trauma after trauma after trauma, even though I was abused as a child growing up under the hand of a scarred World War II veteran. There's a reason why Dennis Jackson is still here making and producing these particular videos. Now, whether or not anybody in the community wants to believe that or support that, that's up to them. But at the same time, don't deny me my right towards me being able to talk and stand up against this demonic wickedness. Because like I said, rather than me become one of them, I'd rather die. The same thing that Ronald Reagan talked about towards surrendering to the enemy. Rather die on your feet than to bow or surrender to the will of the enemy. And that's exactly what I've seen the Christianity movement do here in America. Now for 30 plus years, I'm gonna tag it onto the 40-year period in 1983. That's exactly what I have seen the American Christian Constitution do for the past 40 plus years. They have compromised to the point that it's turned into the very thing that Jesus Christ was warning everybody about, that if the religion that you believe in is a compromised religion, that it's just like salt, that it's lost its potency, that it's become worthless, and it's no good other than to be trampled down by the foot of man. And that is the gospel, my friends. Everything that I just got through talking to you about was things that I can validate coming out of the Bible. And if it hurts your feelings, or if it steps on your toes, or if it makes you angry, well, I can't help it. Because it's not me that's making you angry. It's the things that I'm preaching about that has come out of the King James Bible that is making you angry. It's not me. I'm just the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you what the Bible says about all this stuff.
Ukraine, where this morning missile strikes have been reported in multiple locations. Ukraine's commander-in-chief says Russia's launched 55 air and sea-based missiles into Ukraine in a massive attack, striking close to the central city of Vinnytsia and near the port city of Odessa, taking out 2 critical energy infrastructure facilities. Meanwhile, one missile struck a suburb of Kyiv. The city's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, posting on social media that the strike killed 1 person and injured 2 others. This barrage comes less than a day after both Germany and the U.S. announced they will each be sending tanks to Ukraine for the country to use in its defense against Russia's...
And it should be expected by our military personnel. This should not have been some sort of a surprise. You're poking the bear. And as you're poking the bear is going to respond. But once more, we have been forced into a situation pertaining to Putin that we got to choose between the lesser of the 2 evils, that it's either put up or shut up, because if you don't, this guy is going to aggressively keep going until the point that he's going to become another Hitler over in that particular area that those people are very, very familiar with. He's trying to wiggle and worm himself into that in a very, very discreet, but once more, hidden in plain view type tactic. And if you don't watch, that's exactly what's going to occur. And I think our military is strong enough and powerful enough and smart enough to see it, and that's the reason why that they have made the choice that they have made in regards towards the things that our chief and commander talked about yesterday.
Invasion. Willie?
Joining us now for more on this, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel and former U.S. ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul. He's director of the Institute for International Studies at Stanford and an NBC News international affairs analyst. Good morning to you both, guys. Ambassador, I'll start with you. What is the significance of this move? 31 Abrams tanks coming from the United States. It's going to take some time for them to get there, but symbolically first and then practically when they do get on the ground.
Well, I've been advocating for tanks for Ukraine for several months, so I think it's a great decision. I applaud the decision. Of course, it should have been made earlier, and of course, there should be more tanks announced than was done. But it's a major turning point, not so much for the Abrams, for the tanks that the United States is going to send. Willie, as you just said, it's going to take a long time for them to get there. But that this now opens the doors for European countries, first and foremost the Germans, to send their Leopard tanks that they make, and hopefully many, many other countries will now send the Leopard tanks in time for them to be used in a spring counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are planning.
So, Richard, you've been on.
Let's back up real quick. Right there. Stop it.
For them to,
like they was talking about, it should have been done months ago on the front end towards not allowing for the bear to get such of a stronghold. Now the people have become calloused to what the Ukrainians has been cruelly having to go through for the past 11 months. And now the bear has got a stronghold. And because the bear has got a stronghold, it's going to be that much more tougher and harder to get the bear to retrieve. To where if you would have done this on the second day, within 24 to 48 hours, and engaged in this type of engagement, that would have been a powerful enough message to the oligarchs in Russia to say, you know what, maybe we have bitten off more than we can chew here. Maybe we need to re-examine our decisions towards doing this. But now the water has been tainted. And now it's going to become twice as hard to get them of going the other way. Because they've gotten away with this. They've gotten away with it for the past 11 months. They have purposely targeted civilians, men, women, and children, innocent people. And the world has sat idly by and let this occur. Proof once more is in the pudding. You stop something like this on the front end. You stop it at the crosshairs before it ever gets this powerful or this strong. Once more, the tactic is try to do it hiddenly in plain view. And that's basically what they've gotten away with so far.
But that this now opens the doors for European countries, first and foremost the Germans, to send their Leopard tanks that they make, and hopefully many, many other countries will now send the Leopard tanks in time for them to be used in a spring counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are planning.
So, Richard, you've been on the ground for almost a year now covering this war in Ukraine. How big a deal is this for these tanks to come in, not just from the United States, but as the ambassador said, Germany and the UK as well?
Well, from a military point of view, it's a big deal because it gives the Ukrainians, or will give the Ukrainians, much more mobility in this fight, which is something they need. They've gotten locked into this World War I style trench warfare, with the Ukrainians firing fixed artillery and the Russians firing fixed artillery. And like in World War I, you can see the battles, you can see the battlefields. There's tremendous amount of damage. There's a large number of casualties, but they don't advance very often. You go to the front line, you go a week later, it's often pretty much in the same place. So having more tanks, which are more or less artillery on wheels, the Ukrainians will be able to find new places to launch offensives, come around the Russians, and have a lot more tactical mobility. It also gives the Ukrainian people a huge moral boost, because for the last several months, as the war is kind of locked into a stalemate, which the Ukrainians hope to break with this new influx of mobile weapons, the Ukrainians have been watching what's happening in Europe. They've been watching what's happening in Germany. And from Ukraine's perspective, it seemed like the West, particularly far away from the border, is losing interest in the war, and that over time that Russia could have an advantage if people in Germany and other Western European countries just start to shrug their shoulders and say, who needs to have this fight? Let's just allow Vladimir Putin to take a piece or even all of Ukraine. So this gives them a lot of encouragement as well, that the West is still in it and is putting more skin in the game.
Ambassador McFaul, Jonathan Lemire, as you just noted, the Leopard tanks could be decisive and certainly important in the expected spring offensive, which Russia, we anticipate, mounting in the weeks ahead. But the Abrams, which might be many months, if a year, before they are deployed on the battlefield, it's sort of a nod, U.S. officials told me yesterday. This war has no end in sight. This is going to be with us all for a long time. How do you see the course of this going forward? Do you share the concerns just voiced that other countries in the West will start to lose interest? Is there anything that you think could bring these two sides to the negotiating table? Or do you think President Zelensky sticks with his stated goal of pushing Russia out from every inch of his country, maybe even Crimea?
Well, I'd say two things. Yeah, the Abrams were given so that the German tanks and everybody else could get their Leopards. I think that's very clear. It's going to take a long time to get there. Jet fuel maintenance issues that we've been talking about for weeks and weeks, those are all true. But what I also think, if it's going to be a long war, and remember, after the war, Ukraine still needs to deter Russia from future wars. And so I think this is a positive sign that they're finally flipping over to get on an American platform, the Abrams, instead of their old Soviet-made tanks. And I think that about aircraft, too. I think we're going to have a debate about F-16s soon. And my idea is always do it faster, because it's going to take a long time to deploy it. Better take that first step now. But second, Jonathan, to your point, I don't know the answer to your question. And I don't believe anybody that pretends that they know the answer to that question. It feels like a stalemate. It feels like we could be here for a year from now saying the same things as Richard just said. But that's exactly what we were saying 6 months ago, before the incredibly successful counteroffensives that Ukraine did.
Well, let's look at it from another angle, from a common sense angle. How many times have we been taught, if you give somebody an inch, they'll take a mile? It works off of that same strategy level, that it's actually a day late and a dollar short in regards towards now we have set back, the world has set back and allowed of witnessing these atrocities right in front of our very eyes to fester, to grow, to manipulate our thoughts, or even just try to put it into the realm of our thinking towards it being normal. In other words, we become calloused to some degree, that it's only up until now this type of force is now resisting against the evil empire that Ronald Reagan told the world about 30 plus years ago, that now the world is starting to awaken to. And it's not just that evil force that's out there, but it's several of them out there that are going to play their hand. And if the people allow for it to fester and grow, if you don't, it's kind of like a fire. If you don't stomp the fire out, whenever you first see the fire, then the next thing you know, the fire turns into a raging fire. And now it's 3 times or 5 times or maybe 1,000 times harder to put out than it would have been if you first seen the fire and you put the fire out. In a sense, it is a day late and a dollar short.
Sword. We will see if he does that again. It certainly gets the world's attention. It is something that the Russians can do and can do cheaply. They have nuclear weapons. They just start talking about them or using inflammatory language. The Russians were doing that for a while. For the last several months, they've dialed that back in what seems to be a deliberate campaign. According to a senior U.S. intelligence official, they believe it was a deliberate strategy from Vladimir Putin to stop talking about his nuclear arsenal. We'll see if he starts to ratchet that up again. But going back to what Ambassador McFaul was just saying, this certainly puts pressure on Vladimir Putin. Let's not forget, Vladimir Putin had...
It's a fear tactic by using nuclear armament as a tool. But it's also a gambling tactic on our side in hearing the wolf cry, "Oh, we've heard that before. Oh, we've heard that before." And then all of a sudden, it actually occurs. That's what's going to happen eventually if this continues to fester and if the flame is not put out immediately. That's the reason why I said what I said within the first 48 hours of this outbreak, that it needed to be put out immediately and not to let it fester. And now the world has set back and they've let it fester, and now I'm just afraid. I'm not making a prediction. I'm not forecasting, but now I'm just afraid that the aggressiveness of the bear is going to be 1,000 times harder to get him to retrieve and go back into his little cubby hole.
Across the globe and the increase of anti-Semitism around the world. As part of the coverage, he'll have an exclusive interview from Poland with the second gentleman, Douglas Emhoff, who's tracing his own roots there and will be there for the remembrance. Willie?
One of the most profoundly moving places in the world. Joe will be there for us tomorrow. Speaking of Russia, 4 spectators were kicked out of the Australian Open yesterday for displaying Russian flags, which have been banned from Melbourne Park, also for threatening security guards. Tennis Australia said the flags, one of which included an image of Vladimir Putin, were being waved during a gathering outside of the arena where Novak Djokovic beat Russia's Andrei Rublev in the quarterfinals. Police say the 4 have not been charged, but were in fact evicted from the site. Meanwhile, the International Olympic Committee says Russian athletes should be allowed to compete at the 2024 Games in Paris next summer. In a statement following a meeting of its executive board, the organization said, quote, "No athlete should be prevented from competing just because of their passport," adding, "A pathway for athletes' participation in competition under strict conditions should therefore be further explored." That news comes one day after Ukrainian President Zelensky called for the exclusion of Russian athletes at the Paris Olympics. Back here at home this morning, a new economic report out just moments ago shows the U.S. economy finished 2022 in better shape than expected. The Commerce Department reporting fourth quarter GDP rose at a higher rate than economists had predicted. Let's bring in the co-anchor of CNBC's Squawk Box, Andrew Ross Sorkin, and NBC News senior business analyst, host of the 11th.
I'm gonna avert here and basically.
The Hive ransomware attack prevented the hospital from accepting any new patients. The hospital was also forced to rely on paper copies of patient information. It was only able to recover its data after it paid a ransom. Hive's most recent victim in the Central District of California was attacked on or about December 30th of last year. Its most recent victim in the Central District of Florida was attacked around 15 days ago. In its first year of operation, Hive extorted over $100 million in ransom payments from its victims. Last summer, FBI agents from the Tampa Division, with the support of prosecutors in the Criminal Division's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section and the Middle District of Florida, infiltrated the Hive network and began disrupting Hive's attempts to extort victims. For example, the FBI disrupted a Hive ransomware attack against the Texas school district's computer systems. The Bureau provided decryption keys to the school district, saving it from making a $5 million ransom payment. That same month, the FBI disrupted a Hive ransomware attack on a Louisiana hospital, saving the victim from a $3 million ransom payment. The FBI was also able to disrupt an attack on a food services company. The Bureau provided the company with decryption keys and saved the victim from a $10 million ransom payment. Since July of last year, we provided assistance to over 300 victims around the world, helping to prevent approximately $130 million in ransom payments. Our continued investigative efforts led us to 2 back-end computer servers located in Los Angeles that were used by Hive to store the network's critical information. Last night, pursuant to court order, we seized those servers. We also received court authorization to wrest control of Hive's darknet sites and render its services unavailable. This morning, if a Hive affiliate tries to access their darknet site, this is what they will see. Our investigation into the criminal conduct of Hive members remains ongoing. I want to thank all of the agents, prosecutors, and staff across the department for their work on this matter. I also want to thank the United States Secret Service, as well as all of our international partners, including Germany and the Netherlands, as well as our law enforcement partners at Europol. Cybercrime is a constantly evolving threat. But as I have said before, the Justice Department will spare no resource to identify and bring to justice anyone, anywhere, who targets the United States with a ransomware attack. We will continue to work both to prevent these attacks and to provide support to victims who have been targeted. And together with our international partners, we will continue to disrupt the criminal networks that deploy these attacks. I'm now going to turn over the podium to Deputy Attorney General Monaco.
Once more, we're living in times now to where the crook knows that they can be dishonest, they can be witty, they can be violent to the sense of holding somebody up on the streets and robbing them from their purse or their billfold. But that's chump change today in comparison towards what that they can do towards going into the back door and basically holding these companies ransom, that if they don't produce a certain amount of money, they're going to basically burn out all of their software that's going to cost millions and millions of dollars to replace. We've seen this happen now with New Orleans several different times, to where they would go in and they would hold them hostage, and rather than them try to resist it, they would just go ahead and pay the ransom up front, because they knew that if they didn't, it was going to cost like probably 10 times that in which what they was asking for to replace all their equipment. We're seeing this again and again and again. Now, how come our American politicians, first of all, have allowed for this to come into our environment, our livelihoods, and there hasn't been a better resistance force against this type of activity from the get-go? I've said it before. I'll say it again. it is on the same level of the Trojan horse, that the people thought that whenever they offered this gift, that it was a good gift and that it was something that was going to be something to be admired. And once it got into their domain, they had a bunch of people hidden off inside this horse that come out and basically took them over. In other words, it was disguised. That's exactly what I have said about the internet and social media platforms pertaining to all these different things now that have bombarded the American people. And the majority of the people that's my age or older, it has caught them so unaware, unless they was raised up being very, very educated in the form of these things not being overwhelming to them. The majority of them don't even try to tamper in with this type of activity because they know that it's wicked. And they know that it could be a breaching point to not only others, but to themselves. And that's the reason why that they're spooky or leery of this particular entity that has now come into our existences. Even I, a few years ago, was hacked or breached by somebody over in Sweden of renting out a, I guess it was a regular room for like almost $900, like $200 a night, that broke into one of my accounts and basically compromised that account. Fortunately, the people that I do banking with hunted it down, backed it up, and I didn't lose no money out of it. But the fact of the matter is, they can come from any and everywhere. That's just like whenever you hand somebody a teller, let's say at McDonald's or Burger King or Taco Bell, wherever. You hand them your ATM card and they swipe it. Within a matter of a few seconds, a piece of paper comes out and they hand it back to you. During the time that you hand them that card, they could have their phone set up over in a corner somewhere or even in their pocket using it for a video recorder. And as soon as they get that card, flip it around where the identification numbers are right there as they're swiping the card. And then that same person that's working as a teller takes that video home and starts either using it, or they sell that information to somebody that can use it, that are like 1,000 times more savvier whenever it comes to computer software stuff, that can do just exactly what they're doing right here. And they can either do it on an independent level or they can do it on a big, big level. I mean, we have seen some major, major institutions here in America, including the United States Pentagon, that has been hacked. Some big agency over in Hollywood got hacked or got compromised. I think it had something to do with Hollywood or something. I mean, we have seen this again and again and again. Just as of December the 30th or 31st of last year, less than 3 weeks ago, a major entity pertaining to T-Mobile got compromised, and like 30 million people lost their privacy rights pertaining to their information being stolen. Now, they claim that wasn't no Social Security number stolen, is what they claim. But who's to say that that's even accurate or not? This has become an ongoing event. My son said whenever he first went out to Colorado, somebody was smart enough that whenever he pulled out his ATM card, they was in behind him, and they had their phone out. Once more again, they had their phone out, had it on video, and they sat there and watched, had their chest pointed directly at the person swiping the card. And in doing so, they identified his numbers, identified the bank, and compromised over $5,000 out of his account. This is the part that I talk about, how that our government officials has failed us. because they have allowed for this to come into an existence, into our lives, that is now affecting our lives. And in more ways than one, it's affecting our lives in a very, very harsh, negative, cruel way. A very cruel way. Let me move on.
Good morning. Okay, well, that was just some staggering news coming out of the Department of Justice. Attorney General Garland with some extraordinarily surprising numbers, right? I mean, just the amount of money that these ransomware companies, these ransomware organizations, Hive, was extorting from companies, hospitals, schools across our country. Back with us is NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julie Ainsley. This is the new world of the future.
It is, Jose, and something that really jumped out to me here is that the FBI was actually able to prevent the payment of $130 million in ransomware from those victims. That really stands out as a victory for DOJ and FBI here, because in the past, so many people have said, look, we know that we have groups like CISA who come in, they do the after action, they see what the damage was, they trace it, they try to hold those responsible. But when you have a group like Hive that for years can extort victims like schools, like food companies, like hospitals, it's important to have someone you can go to in real time. And so the fact that the FBI is able to have experts who can give people a way out of paying these ransoms and to be able to get their software back online, that's a victory, even though that's $130 million out of so much more that they did extort. And then, of course, you heard the big action last night. The FBI was able to take down those servers in Los Angeles. It's interesting they were able to operate that right here in the U.S. Well, we know this is an international organization. Its leaders were Russian speaking, but they believe that they were operating from around the world, continuously extorting people, especially people providing critical infrastructure for the nation, like food services and hospitals and schools, and now they've been able to shut this down. But unfortunately, it's a game of whack-a-mole, and the game is always changing. So the FBI has to keep up with these groups, because once they knock down one path, they'll find another way in.
Julie Ainsley, thank you so very much.
So it's a matter of working smarter and not harder, in a sense, towards what that our officials have to deal with today. And now it's after the fact, towards what they're having to deal with, that obviously somebody didn't look at and analyze before they let this cat out of the bag, or this genie out of the bottle, back, I guess, in the 70s or 80s, whenever all this stuff was coming about that the military had access to, and now the military gave it over to the public, and now these are the consequences in doing so. So obviously somebody did not think this through properly whenever they first done this. It basically goes back to the deal with the Saudi Arabians pertaining to OPEC, of giving them this power to have all this oil that has helped to finance all these major terrorist industries all over the world. Because of the oil, we have given them an inch, and now they're taking a mile. And you're going to see this again and again and again until true justice stands up against this type of behavior and stomps it out. Stomps it out.
But let's be clear, Jose, that the Biden administration moved to end Title 42. They are going to end Title 42. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus and so many have urged the Biden administration to end Title 42, and they have ended Title 42. However, the Supreme Court and the court system have forced them to continue to implement Title 42. Unfortunately, that's the law of the land. They're building on other legal pathways for asylum seekers to come in.
That's another area, another weak area that our enemy has found an area to breach, which is for all these people to be honing in on America. We're being attacked, infiltrated by the enemy that's coming in by the boatloads, might say, towards taking away our resources. Taking away our resources. Every time that a major calamity happens pertaining to the forces of nature, it don't matter if it's a ice storm, it don't matter if it's a too much heat, too much cold, too much rain, not enough rain. Every time these things are off balance, it affects the resources. And if you affect the resources by ravaging them again and again and again, even though you got a strong empire like America, it can be broken. And that's what people are looking at towards us being $30 trillion plus in debt and realizing that, my God, we have literally let the wolf into the chicken coop, and now the wolf is devouring the chickens. I personally think it all began originally in the 60s, whenever they assassinated one of our presidents. I think that at that point in time, politicians that used to be strong, that did not compromise with all these different immigrants in all these different countries, I think at that point in time they started giving the farm away. And they have given the farm away in little bits here, little bits there, little bits here, little bits there. And it's just like whenever Sam Walton died, you know, Walmart pledged that they would always sell America, America, America first until the founder of that company died. And then we see what his children done towards compromising and going just the opposite direction that their father did not intend for them to go in, towards basically bringing everything from offshore labor retail products into our existences. And yeah, there's no doubt, people's got flat screen TVs by and large. They've got more gizmos and gadgets. Most of them have stuff that they only look at or use once or twice and then throw it into the closet or up in the attic somewhere and never use it again. Yeah, we've been exposed to all this stuff, but what good has it done us? It has taken away our future. It has stolen our children's future towards them having a good labor market to depend upon. That way they could strive towards being honest and decent, and they could be loyal to a company towards working for 25, 30 or more years and retiring and living out the rest of their lives in the so-called golden era, the rocking chair golden era. Those dreams, those desires have been diminished. They haven't been completely taken, but by and large, they have been diminished, which has hurt our morale over here, which has added to the concept of the drug inducement, of the suicides, of the people that's now resorting to crime, that probably never would have resorted to crime if those same entities would have still been in power. And now, because of the black market being so strong, it's more enticing for somebody to do just like you got through seeing, towards being a hacker, towards trying to hold people hostage and becoming rich off of it. They're no longer robbing people on the streets like they used to. The purse snatchers, by and large, is over with. People, by and large, don't handle large amount of cash. So, doing things the old-fashioned primitive way, back whenever you used to have bushwhackers, back in the cowboy and Indian days, those days is over with, my friends. And if you're not willing to adjust to that and realize that, then it's no one's fault but your own. Because these banks, these institutions, even cities are now vulnerable towards wicked, hurtful, harmful people that are willing to do this again and again and again. I'll just say this real quick pertaining to the information that I just put out there pertaining to the world warming up from the inside out. Some people may get the ideal. Well, he got that ideal off watching this movie, The Core. I don't even think I've ever seen the movie The Core until just recently. And whenever I say recently, I'm talking about just within the past few weeks. It was whenever the tornado struck here in Northwest Tennessee and up towards Hickman, Kentucky, that made me look at some things. And one of those things that God gave me the instincts towards looking at was Edgar Cayce, that was born in the late 1800s, that died along about, I think it was 1942 or something like that, that used to live up towards Hopkinsville, Kentucky, that was considered being the sleeper prophet, that basically could prophesy in his dreams or during the time that he was basically asleep. And one of the things that he had a vision about was that the poles up underneath our feet pertaining to the magna would change poles. Well, scientists claim that this has already occurred. I don't know if they can prove that scientifically. I don't even know how that they can even go down 3,000 miles into the ground unless they're doing it with sonar, because you darn sure can't take a steel bit and drill down 3,000 miles. So I don't even know how that they're even getting down that deep to even make this type of accurate assessment pertaining to what is below our feet. The only thing that I do know, and once more, proof is in the pudding, is that we have been inundated for the past 35, 40 years with all these major volcanoes that's erupting. And they're not just erupting above ground, but the majority of them are erupting below the seas. It's almost as if the world is regurgitating within itself, and all the fire and magna that was in the center of the earth is now trying to break away and come to the outer layers of the earth, that is helping to warm up the water, that is helping to warm up the atmosphere, that is helping to create all this calamity pertaining to forces of nature, which goes back to the Luciferian Lucifer that deceived everybody, especially the oil petroleum tycoons, in believing that global warming did not exist. Well, now we have given this entity an inch, and now it's taken a mile, and now all of a sudden we still have climate deniers that are in denial about the world warming up. We're always going to have people that's going to deny the truth. There's going to be denial truth breakers from here on in, and they're going to be, and just like going all the way back to the beginning of time, whenever the devil entered into the serpent, and the serpent basically lied to Adam and Eve by saying, oh, no, if you eat of that fruit, if you do that, you will gain the knowledge of a God. And they persuaded them of doing something that God told them not to do, because there would be consequences and complications towards doing it. Well, guess what Adam and Eve done according to the book of life? They fell in prey. They fell for the temptation. They was bamboozled. They was entrapped by this evil demonic entity. And I keep saying that it was only up until the tornadoes hit that I started looking at the things that Edgar Cayce talked about pertaining to the tornadoes, the way that a tornado will come down. It basically starts as a rolling up piece of carpet in the atmosphere above our heads. And then once it becomes so heavy, it drops down. Once it drops down, then it turns into a tornado. In the sense of the tornado, it turns into a vacuum cleaner. But not only does it turn into a vacuum cleaner, it just don't have a bag to put it in, it throws it everywhere. It also magnetizes itself. And because of the magnification up underneath our feet pertaining to the stuff that I'm talking about, it has now gotten out of tune with itself to the point that it basically holds that tornado down to the ground. Not only does the suction part keep it down to the ground, but once it starts, it's magnetically pulled down to the ground, kind of like a magnet that keeps that energy, or keeps that magnetic force pulled down to the ground. What does the Bible say? The Bible says that in the last days, Satan will come down, D-O-W-N, down, wreaking havoc upon humanity. It says in the Bible that he will come down in great wrath, because he knoweth his time is short. What we are exposing is Satan throwing a tantrum because he knows that he has failed in this competition that began thousands of years ago, that now people such as myself are onto it in what that it is doing. And because of it, it is lashing out at not just the American people, but the world in general. And unless we're willing to wake up to this, my friends, and combat against this evil, because like I told you a while ago, God has basically lifted his hand off of this planet, that he was protecting the planet. But, you know, once you bite the hand at feeding you again and again and again, eventually the hand will quit feeding you. Eventually that protection will be lifted. Now, whenever a tornado hits, by and large, or a bad event, God protects those people that cry out to him. And we have seen incident after incident after incident, times a trillion incidences, where God has protected that particular family or that particular individual in not allowing for them to die. Just like God has protected me again and again, pertaining to me not meeting the widowmaker, as far as God still allowing for me to live right now toward being able to make these videos. But the people are going to have to awaken. They're going to have to awaken to the problems with the illegal immigrants. They're going to have to awaken with all of the computer hackers pertaining to how the smart thief has now infiltrated our own system. They're going to have to wake up to these election deniers. They're going to have to wake up to all this other horrible, horrible stuff that the church world has allowed into their lives. And now it's just like poisonous Putin. It's going to be 1,000 times harder to stop that aggression than it would have been if you would have stopped it on the front end. You nip it at the bud. You don't wait for something to fester and fester and fester. It's just like cancer. Okay, the medical industry knows that if they can identify cancer before it ever gets a strong hold, their odds of beating that is like 1,000 to 1 greater than it would have been if they waited and waited and waited and 6 months to a year later decide, okay, we're going to put you through this chemotherapy and see if we can't stop the progression of this cancer. Well, by that time, it's already got a foothold. It's already got a toehold. And now the cancer has become 1,000 times harder to beat. Same way with anything in anybody's life. If there's a problem going on, you need to address it immediately. You don't need to procrastinate it, because the more that you procrastinate it, the more that it's going to be that much more difficult to deal with. That's the best advice that I can give anybody pertaining to anybody that gets a hold of any of the material that I put out. And once more, the incentive, the ideal, the vision, the desire towards wanting to help humanity and putting out these messages pertaining to the world heating up from the inside out versus the outside in, like a lot of our most meteorologists and scientists was telling us, was only part of the truth. The other part is the part where the earth is warming up from the inside out. And it's because of draining all the natural resources out of the ground. We're disturbing the atom content, the very existences towards how that it runs. We're taking a machine out of tune, the ecosystem. And you got to admit, what goes on underneath our feet is an ecosystem, just like what goes on in the oceans is an ecosystem, just like what goes on in our regular day of life, in our atmosphere, that's an ecosystem, just like what goes on in the clouds pertaining to the atmosphere above us, that is an ecosystem. And if you really want to think about the ecosystem, look at the solar system. Look at the moon. Look at the stars. Look at the sun. Look at how everything operates in a mechanical form. That is called an ecosystem. That is generated by God, that is supposed to operate in a certain way. Once you disfigure or take that normalcy away from that ecosystem, then you're going to see complications arise such as you could never ever begin to fathom or believe. Thank you once again for your time, your patience. Thank you for your prayers. God bless you in your praying for the founder of the Windmill Ministries here at 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255. We want to say, God bless America. God bless our troops. God bless America's endeavors towards where we go from this moment on. And we want to say good luck to each and every one of us. And heaven help us all in saying shalom. If there's ever been a time that we needed to unite, it is today. God bless.